During the decade of the U.S. Army's experiment with gliders in war, nearly as many glider pilots died in training as they did in combat. The Waco CG-4A gliders, fabric-wrapped metal tubing with a wooden floor, were nicknamed by others as death crates, tow targets, plywood hearse, and flying coffins. Given the conditions for its deployment, the aircraft performed surprisingly well, a one-way mission behind enemy lines with no motor, no parachutes, and no second chances. American glider pilots had flown perilous missions at the tip of the Allied spear all across Europe, and many felt slighted by a lack of recognition or awards after the war. They had left as innocent young men who had seen little more than a fistfight. They returned hardened, many haunted, some bitter, and a few alcoholic. Such is the legacy of war. Crippling scars. Nightmares. Sights and sounds that remain as fresh as yesterday. Joseph had been bound for medical school. Sam was working in a logging camp, Stephen on neighbors' farms. Lawrence hated his Navy posting in Puerto Rico. On the eve of World War II, they were among thousands of young men who dreamed of becoming a fighter pilot. Instead, they were destined to climb aboard a motorless aircraft not yet invented. They would become combat glider pilots, led by a man who had been the second choice of both his father and the U.S. Army when he applied for admission to West Point. Henry Hap Arnold, from Gladwine, Pennsylvania, a wealthy Philadelphia suburb, was a likable fellow, prone to pranks, and later admitted he was a minimal-effort cadet. He graduated 66th in a class of 111. Arnold's prospects for an Army career were dim at best, and at one point he suffered from a profound fear of flying. But by the mid-1930s, he had developed a reputation for aircraft research and development, and surprisingly cheerful, cooperative, and inspirational leadership skills. In 1938, Arnold, now a general, took command of a moribund Army Air Corps at the start of the pre-war's aviation arms race. Arnold ordered the study of combat gliders 3 years later, with the notion that they would deliver troops and light armament to the battlefield, that glider pilots would be the Sherpas of World War II. The glider design approved in 1942 was 48 feet long with a wingspan of nearly 84 feet, about the size of a B-25 medium bomber. Reinforced fabric wrapped around metal tubing and a wood floor. There were no engines, no defensive guns, and no parachutes for the two pilots. Comprising 70,000 parts, it was a squarish and remarkably strong design with a payload of about 3,700 pounds of men or equipment. Compared to a fighter, its controls were about as sophisticated as a go-kart. The Rush program was riddled with missteps, false starts, and second-class treatment compared to powered aircraft. Once the Waco CG-4A glider design was approved, manufacturing became a circus. In fact, one manufacturer literally tried to build a glider in a circus tent. Ford builders had no aircraft manufacturing experience. Another was accused of gross mismanagement. At one facility, 90% of glued parts failed. On one occasion, an instructor leaned against a wing during his lecture, and it fell off the fuselage. Tragically, glider wings sometimes separated in mid-flight. In one accident, 10 people, including the mayor of St. Louis and other civic leaders, were killed during a public demonstration when metal components failed under pressure. Later, the glider fleet would be grounded for inspections due to shabby manufacturing in some cases. Meanwhile, glider pilot training schools were established in deserts, farm fields, and prairies. Many students were flunked-out aviation cadets, men who were too old for flight crew training, men who wanted adventure, brawlers who detested discipline and lived only for combat, wrote one glider pilot. Others wrote to their families, glossing over the tragedies of classmates dying when their gliders slammed into the ground. Finally, in late 1942, the training regimen began to take shape as the first gliders arrived at the schools. Soon students would earn wings with a G at its center. Not for glider, the new pilots said. It stood for guts. America had already been at war for nearly a year, and Nazi Germany had successfully used glider-borne troops to capture Ebony Mail Fortress during the invasion of Belgium on May 10, 1940. America was behind the curve. American glider pilots did not become test pilots for the Army Air Corps until early 1943 as the Allied invasion of Sicily approached. The amphibious assault, the Allies' largest air-sea operation up to that point of the war, would entail more than 3,000 ships, 150,000 ground troops, and 4,000 aircraft, including 144 gliders. The Allied glider plan for the night of July 9 smelled of disaster from the beginning. British glider pilots had flown very little in recent months. Many would have to train to fly the American CG-4 as in place of the British Horsa gliders. Further, there were not enough British glider pilots for the gliders assigned to the mission. 24 American glider pilots, with no combat experience, volunteered to fly as co-pilots. They would be towed by American C-47's crews, also inexperienced in combat. More than a few American glider pilots were furious with the mission plan, they later admitted. In fact, the mission plan would have frightened combat veterans. The glider pilots would take off in Tunisia at night and in high winds, cross the Mediterranean in stormy weather, release far from shore, glide across 3,000 feet of ocean, pass over the Allied naval fleet, and then the beach under enemy fire from 3 sides, and finally look for their landing zones. Disaster unfolded in slow motion. Several tow planes with gliders attached turned back to base shortly after takeoff when glider loads shifted. 3 other gliders broke free and vanished into the sea without a trace. 2 tow planes got lost and turned back. By the time the remainder approached the wind-whipped coast of Sicily in the dark, chaos reigned. Debates erupted between glider and tow plane crews as enemy fire appeared up ahead. Dozens of gliders were released prematurely, guaranteeing they would never make it to shore. Some glider pilots took friendly fire from Allied ships staged offshore during the next day's assault. The lack of Allied naval communication and coordination infuriated some glider pilots for the rest of their lives. Long before the sun rose, dozens of glider pilots and their glider infantrymen clung to floating wreckage, debating whether to swim for shore or hold on and wait for search parties. Some swam toward the beach and disappeared. Many drowned throughout the night before the survivors were rescued at dawn. The glider corps' portion of Operation Husky had become an unmitigated disaster. Only 5 of 144 gliders made it to their landing zones. 69 gliders were released too far out at sea to reach the shore. Of 24 American glider pilots, only 2 made it ashore and 6 were killed in action. Overall, 605 officers and men were lost, more than half due to drowning. Although the Allies captured Sicily less than 6 weeks later, questions about the use of airborne tactics lingered. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander in the Mediterranean, openly questioned the wisdom of massive airborne operations. It appeared that gliders could be combat effective only at an exorbitant cost in casualties and resources. As Eisenhower contemplated the fate of gliders and the airborne, the surviving glider pilots vented their horror and revulsion in letters and after-action reports. But the glider forces learned fast. Hours before the 4th Infantry Division waded ashore on Utah Beach nearly a year later on June 6, 1944, nearly 200 glider pilots had landed about 6 miles inland, engaging portions of Germany's 42 divisions along the French coast, slowing the movement of enemy troops, seizing causeways, and delivering supplies for thousands of paratroopers. They were the first of 6 waves of more than 500 gliders in the first 24 hours of the Airborne's Operation Neptune in support of Operation Overlord. They arrived on a mission that Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory had called unsound in principle, in part due to their long approach over enemy territory, low altitude, and little hope of surprise after a 3-hour flight over the English Channel. Arriving under a full moon or in daylight, he had feared casualty rates of as much as 70% in the morning and sunset sorties on D-Day, plus the glider sorties the morning of D+1. Operation Overlord indeed, surprise had vanished as the sky lightened on June 6. As they approached their landing zones, glider pilots braved a pyramid of enemy crossfire. One glider pilot believed a German fighter strafed his glider, shooting away his right aileron control and hitting his tow rope, causing it to unravel. When ground fire blew off the rudder control, he was within seconds of disaster as he separated from his tow plane. Others followed suit. As Allied troops came ashore a few miles away, it seemed nearly every glider landing resembled a gymnast's floor routine. Hard landings with a thud. Stopping a glider up on its front skids and risking a somersault. Catching a wingtip and cartwheeling. Caroming off a tree that ripped away a wing. A concussion likely was proof of a good landing. For many, battle sounds at first were fuzzy, yelled conversations, unintelligible. Every field in Normandy became a separate battlefield. Recon photos taken earlier at midday failed to depict the height of hedgerows separating the fields. Instead of the bushes as they appeared to be in the photos, many were 5-foot-high dirt embankments that separated the fields. Bramble thickets covered most embankments, along with dense stands of mature trees. Glider pilots discovered Normandy was a checkerboard of tiny battlefields. Some glider wrecks were not easily spotted from the air. Here and there, a tail revealed where a glider had burrowed into trees. Some gliders were piled on top of others, or flipped onto their tops. Others sat forlornly in a clearing, alone and on their bellies, their wings mangled, tails shot away, as if a giant bird had been shot high in the sky and then had belly flopped onto the ground, spread-eagled and silent. Open doors hinted that perhaps glider pilots and passengers had somehow survived. Combat brought new horrors. It was then that I learned the true meaning of the word terror. Glider pilot Richard Libby later wrote. I could not think. We started moving. The first glider pilot I saw was Ben Wink's co-pilot. Where's Ben? Ben's dead. I'll never forget those words as long as I live. He had so much confidence. He was so sure he was coming back. Similar nightmares would haunt Normandy glider pilots for a lifetime, shared only in a few letters, journals, and at reunions. Although less than 50 glider pilots were killed in Operation Neptune, the casualty rate among the glider infantry they carried approached 11%, a high price. Yet the glider pilots delivered more than 4,000 men to the battlefield, nearly 100 pieces of artillery, almost 300 vehicles, and 300 tons of cargo. The fabric-covered gliders proved far tougher than most observers would have predicted, and their durability kept occupants alive, but at a price. Approximately 97% of the gliders in Operation Neptune were too badly damaged to use a second time. Left to rot, wrote one glider pilot. Meanwhile, the troops coming ashore with glider support suffered fewer casualties than those who did not. Yet the lessons were painful. Recon photos were of dubious value. Night missions were nearly suicidal. Releasing gliders at a higher than designated altitude dispersed glider landings. Tow planes were vulnerable to enemy fire. Pathfinders were critical to securing landing zones before the gliders' arrival. Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, was less than 2 months away. Would gliders be used then, or ever again? Operation Dragoon. Christ, what a mess. Dragoon glider pilot Jack Merrick wrote after the war. Everywhere I looked, there were gliders in free flight, or still tagging along behind tow planes taking evasive action trying not to run into each other. I watched one glider come whistling in at about 100 miles per hour, hook a wing, and go cartwheeling down the field like a cheerleader at a football game. I later heard stories about a glider in free flight just being missed by a falling jeep, and even some being shot at by ships in our own invasion fleet. Confusion was the enemy in Operation Dragoon, on August 15, 1944. Long anticipated by the Germans, 2,500 Allied ships would bring 145,000 troops ashore. If successful, the Allies would be positioned to advance on Marseilles, a critical port. A giant pincer attack from the Riviera north and from Normandy southward could cut off Hitler's troops in western France. Meanwhile, 10,000 airborne troops would be delivered inland, generally in the Argent Valley, in the span of 15 hours. Glider pilots again would play a key role, with 76 gliders scheduled for an early morning arrival, Operation Bluebird, followed by 348 gliders about 10 hours later, Operations Dove and Canary. Once again, mission planning and the Fates joined the Germans as enemies of the glider forces. Early morning fog blanketed the landing zone. The American CG-4S pressed ahead, even as one glider suddenly lost a wing and plunged into the sea. The remainder achieved a remarkable record when 33 of 37 gliders set down in their prescribed LZs, landing zones, likely the best single serial success rate of the war. But chaos took command later in the day. Deep dust clouds hid landing zones, turning Operation Dove's approach into a rodeo as planned separation, altitude, and timing all broke down. At one point, dozens of gliders were in free flight in broad, descending circles. As if they were over a drain, drawing closer with each passing second, one glider pilot after another dove out of the converging pattern when he spotted a clearing. Not only did recon photos fail to distinguish grapevines in some landing zones, but many clearings, farm fields, and cow pastures had been mined, flooded, or studded with upright tree trunks, up to about a foot wide and 10 feet tall, a mutant picket fence nicknamed Bromwell's asparagus, to demolish gliders skidding to a stop. Most of one glider pilot's right wing broke away when it collided with another glider as both simultaneously landed, sounding like an implosion of a giant wooden matchbox. And then much of the other wing disappeared in a tangle of vines. The bottom of the glider disintegrated, plowing dirt into the fuselage filled with glider infantry. But it stopped before reaching the trees. "Nice landing, Lieutenant," one of the soldiers yelled to the glider pilot. Spacing glider serials only 10 minutes apart proved more deadly than a broken-down German army that offered minimal resistance. Even more so than over Normandy, in-flight delays and changes in the flight plan forced gliders pilots out of their planned approaches and anticipated release at 600 feet. Some were stacked far higher than that, and others nearly overflew gliders that had taken off ahead of them. Yet, for all the confusion that marked glider operations, Operation Dragoon was an overwhelming success. By the end of the first day, every combat unit of the 6th Corps was ashore. Within hours, Allied advancements inland were ahead of schedule against modest German resistance. Meanwhile, not a single glider that had landed inland could be recovered for later use. Gliders littered the countryside, shattered, broken, and sometimes still containing glider pilots' equipment and supplies. Yet somehow, only 11 glider pilots were killed and just 32 wounded, a remarkably low casualty rate among the 675 glider pilots. Operation Market Garden in Holland would commence only 1 month after Dragoon, on September 17, 1944. The largest glider mission of World War II, more than 1,900 gliders would need pilots from every corner of America, including some who had just pinned their wings on their chests for the first time. Like the others before it, Market Garden was a plan riddled with risk, an Allied invasion from Belgium up through eastern Holland near the German border to seize the town of Arnhem and its strategic bridge. If successful, the Allies could then flank the northern end of the Germans' defensive Siegfried Line and drive into the heart of the Ruhr industrial region, while Allied bombers pounded the gun and tank factories there. It would be a dagger into the heart of Germany. To accomplish that, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed the largest airborne operation to date. American airborne troops would seize about 50 miles of Highway 69, a narrow two-lane road, running north from the Belgian border, in 2 sectors near Nijmegen, 82nd Airborne, and Eindhoven, 101st Airborne, farther south. That would enable the British Second Army's XXX Corps to drive from the Belgian border up Highway 69, through Eindhoven and Nijmegen, and link up with the British attacking at Arnhem farther north. Massive glider sorties would support the 82nd and 101st with glider infantry, supplies, ordnance, and artillery. It was an ominous plan from the beginning. The go decision came only a few days before the mission, making it the first major airborne mission of the war without significant rehearsal training. The mission would require so many glider pilots that glider infantry would sit in the co-pilot seats, after about 10 minutes, training, just before takeoff. After crossing the English Channel, 2 glider approach corridors from the north and south crossed into enemy territory before reaching the landing zones, in daylight, and, following more than 30,000 paratroopers, with no element of surprise. But beginning on D-Day, September 17, 1944, bad British weather and then heavy concentrations of German artillery shredded Montgomery's plan. For 3 days, fog and rain plagued the Allied air bases surrounding London and over the North Sea, forcing airborne departure delays, route changes, and cancellations. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the British assault in Arnhem stalled, the 101st and 82nd met stiff resistance, and glider pilots flew into hell. Their long approach to landing zones became a war film played in fast-forward, flashing images outside the cockpit, the columns of artillery shells, bullets splitting the air inside the fuselage, grisly smells filling nostrils until the movie ended with a glider belly down in a field. After landing, some glider pilots were horrified at the enemy fire that their infantry passengers had taken. In one glider, an infantry corporal slumped with a hole the size of a softball in his chest. Not far away, 3 others looked like they had been shot through with a single slug, probably a 20mm that hadn't exploded before exiting under the wing. The glider pilots' post-war memoirs laid bare the sorrow and horror of glider warfare in Holland. On D+1 and D+2, approximately 1,500 intrepid glider pilots delivered infantry, anti-tank, anti-aircraft, engineer, and recon personnel to the 82nd and 101st. They braved flak so thick that it reminded one pilot of crows over a tree. On D+2, the most brutal enemy artillery fire of the mission forced many to fly lower than expected and risk mid-air collisions. Rush hour. In the air forced some glider pilots to be released an untenable 15 miles from their intended landing zones. At one point, a glider pilot glanced down at the floor near his seat. His glider infantry had lined the bottom of the cockpit near him with their flak jackets, because, "If anything happens to you, we're gone," said one infantryman. Another glider pilot watched a wing fall away from his buddy's glider. At 500 feet, it turned nose down. His good friend slammed nose first into a ditch, crushing everyone and everything inside. On D+6, the sun finally greeted glider pilots. But Operation Market Garden had failed and the attacking British had retreated from the strategic bridge. The plan had targeted one bridge too far. With no glider command structure on the ground, glider pilots were largely left to find their own way back to base. Some took a few extra days to sightsee, adding to a general reputation of glider pilots as rapscallions. Yet they had delivered 8,500 men into battle as well as 900 tons of supplies. Glider pilots amounted to 5% of the men on the ground at the end of Market Garden, the equivalent of a regiment but with only modest combat training at best. Meanwhile, letters written by glider pilots who did not return were forwarded to families back home. Others received missing in action telegrams, offering a sliver of hope. Only 3 months later, a rescue mission would turn deadly over frozen ground. Some of the wounded had been in there for days. It looked like the Atlanta station scene in Gone with the Wind. The only glider rescue mission of World War II comprised perhaps its most overlooked operation, the Battle of the Bulge. Winter had iced the war in December 1944, along a 75-mile stretch in the Ardennes forest in the southeastern third of Belgium. Biting winds, temperatures approaching 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and heavy snows had arrived. It was a time to dig in, hunker down, and replenish as the weather allowed. But on December 16th, the snow had crackled under thousands of German soldiers' boots 2 hours before sunrise. The vanguard of approximately 1,000 German tanks headed west toward the Meuse River in central Belgium, breaking through Allied defenses. 2 days later, the 101st Airborne Division mobilized with only 2 days' rations as reinforcements headed for Bastogne aboard almost 400 trucks. They joined approximately 18,000 American troops in the Bastogne area who became surrounded by an estimated 45,000 Germans. For the first time in World War II, glider pilots would not lead an amphibious invasion in Europe. They would not deliver glider infantry and battle supplies to paratroopers behind enemy lines. This time, rescue was the priority. After several desperate pleas from the 101st, 11 gliders surprised the Germans late on December 26, delivering surgeons, medical supplies, and tank fuel at 5:30 p.m. Only 40 minutes earlier, the lead tank of General George S. Patton's rescue troops reached the outskirts of the 101st perimeter. Once again, mission planning contributed to making the next day one of the deadliest glider missions of the war. There were no trained co-pilots on this mission when their commanding officer decided the cargo of high-explosive ammunition was too dangerous to risk 2 trained pilots per glider. They also would fly the same route as the gliders flew the day before, even though command learned at the last minute the route Patton's tanks had blazed was now a safer option. Remarkably, only 3 of the first 25 gliders failed to reach the landing zone. But 18 of the next 25 glider pilots either did not reach the landing zone, were killed, or taken prisoner. Of the last 12 glider pilots in Operation Repulse, 8 became prisoners of war. 3 others were killed. Only 1 returned to base. You can't imagine what it was like. You know how a goose feels when he flies over a bunch of hunters and they start shooting? A glider pilot years asked after the war. Flak, so black, it reminded me of a black summer storm cloud, wrote another glider pilot. By percentage, the flights to Bastogne on the 27th was the costliest glider day of the war for some units. 32% of the glider pilots that day were killed or captured. By comparison, historian Rex Schama noted that of the 2,933 glider pilots in Operations Neptune and Market Garden, 114 were listed as killed or missing, a loss of less than 4%. Losses on December 27 proportionately were 8 times greater than World War II's 2 largest glider missions to date. Yet the glider pilots delivered 100,000 pounds of cargo on that final day, and the surgeons and medical supplies they delivered on both days likely saved untold lives. Glider pilots' scars from Operation Repulse ran deep. Not enough enemy position information furnished. Need timely and accurate information on enemy positions and AA. No flak suits or parachutes, and we were carrying gasoline. Glider operations very poor, no flak suits in glider. Briefing very poor, news 48 hours old. Glider warfare remained a work in progress. Varsity, one final mission in early 1945, the Allies had reached the western bank of the Rhine River. The Western Front now stretched 450 miles from the Swiss Alps to Holland. The inevitable thrust into Germany would come in March, a few miles northwest of the German city of Basel. 3 Allied armies would ford the river, supported by the U.S. 17th and British 6th Airborne Divisions that would fly over the Rhine to drop troops, supplies, and release gliders about 6 miles into Germany near the Issel River. Operation Varsity would be the largest ground and airborne assault since Normandy. The airborne assault would include more than 1,800 powered aircraft, 900 American gliders, and nearly 450 British gliders, so many gliders that one would be taking off every 12 seconds for nearly 3 hours. Veteran glider pilots flying their last combat mission of the war recognized lessons from earlier assignments. No night flight like Normandy. No multi-day missions over a prepared enemy as Holland had been. Unlike Market Garden, there would be plenty of rehearsal exercises before the real thing. Regardless, maintaining preordained separation between the serials again proved impossible on March 24, 1945. Clear landing zones remained more wish than reality. Prevailing winds pushed chemical smoke ordered by Montgomery to conceal the river crossing drifted over the landing zones and enveloped visual landmarks. Flying blind wasn't part of the plan as gliders released from their tow planes, turned in a broad circle like eagles looking for prey, and then disappeared down into the smoke, according to one glider pilot. Some of the most vicious enemy anti-aircraft artillery fire of the war greeted the gliders. Horror abounded. One glider pilot thought he had run over a paratrooper when he landed but learned later the paratrooper had already been shot dead as he had descended. Another glider pilot suffered burns on his right arm, right foot, ear, the top of his head, neck, and face. Nearby his co-pilot was on fire. He had managed to exit and then had fallen to the ground. He died where he fell. Post-war accounts by the pilots who survived reek with remorse, sorrow, and sometimes survivor's guilt. Meanwhile, for the first time some glider pilots had been given ground combat orders. The 435th Provisional Glider Pilot Infantry Company, 188 glider pilots, had received additional combat training for roadblock duty the night of March 24. Shortly before midnight, an estimated 200 Germans approached their position. The firefight erupted when an enemy tank approached their position. Red tracers from every direction revealed positions and targets. Hours later, sunrise revealed 15 dead Germans, more than 20 wounded enemy prisoners, and 80 others taken prisoner after what became known as the Battle of Burg Gun Corner. Glider pilots paid a horrific price for the successful thrust into Germany. Every 9 minutes, a glider pilot on approach was killed by enemy fire or in a mid-air explosion, was crushed in a mangled glider, or died from shrapnel or gunfire. That amounted to nearly 40% of all the glider pilots killed in World War II and more than the glider pilot deaths in Operations Neptune and Market Garden combined. But now, the road to Berlin was clear. It had crossed Normandy, then up through southern France, and across Belgium into Holland, and now into the fatherland. America's glider pilots had flown at the tip of the Allied spear across the width and breadth of the European theater of operations. In only 9 months. Future operations? The invasion of Japan loomed over the western horizon. Soon glider pilots began testing various techniques for landing in rice paddies, a far cry from French vineyards and hedgerows. Hiroshima ended that mission preparation and assured the gliders' obituary. A few post-war training exercises and rescues took place, using gliders to supply Canadian troops above the Arctic Circle and to rescue aircrews after plane crashes in Greenland and the Yukon Territory. But in 1952, the U.S. Air Force's Joint Airborne Troop Board wrote, "Gliders, as an airborne doctrine, are obsolete, and should no longer be included in airborne techniques, concepts and doctrine, or in references thereto." Hundreds of glider pilots had given their lives, nearly equally divided between combat and in training in World War II. In fact, when paratroopers had preceded them into enemy territory alerting the enemy, glider pilots paid a disproportional price from the lack of surprise. A vintage black and white photograph, high detail, documentary style, of the weathered fabric-wrapped metal tubing and wooden floor of a Waco CG-4A glider, nicknamed Death Crate, under natural light, conveying a somber, historical atmosphere. Cinematic, photorealistic, 4K. A candid black and white vintage photograph showing a group of earnest, young men in pre-war civilian clothes, looking upward with hopeful expressions, their faces reflecting innocence, subtly contrasted with the faint silhouette of a glider in the distance, hinting at an uncertain future. Somber atmosphere, cinematic, photorealistic, 4K. A detailed, black and white vintage photograph, documentary style, of a young Henry Hap Arnold, his expression contemplative, hinting at an underlying anxiety, with an early aircraft faintly visible in a hangar background, under natural light. Somber atmosphere, cinematic, photorealistic, 4K. A high detail, black and white vintage photograph, documentary style, showing a partially constructed Waco CG-4A glider, its metal tubing and wood frame exposed, inside a makeshift, dimly lit manufacturing tent, emphasizing rudimentary construction and chaotic conditions. Natural light, somber atmosphere, cinematic, photorealistic, 4K. A candid black and white vintage photograph of young glider pilot recruits, with determined but weary expressions, practicing a landing in a vast, dusty training field under a stark, natural light. A newly earned wing patch with a G is visible on one uniform, symbolizing guts. Somber atmosphere, cinematic, photorealistic, 4K. A high detail, black and white vintage photograph, documentary style, capturing the silhouettes of C-47 tow planes with Waco's CG-4A gliders attached, preparing for a nighttime takeoff from a windswept airfield. The sky is turbulent and dark, conveying a sense of impending disaster. Cinematic, photorealistic, 4K. A somber, black and white vintage photograph, documentary style, depicting fragmented floating wreckage on a stormy, dark Mediterranean Sea. Faint, distant light streaks, symbolic of muzzle flashes, appear on the horizon, abstractly hinting at chaos and friendly fire. Candid, high detail, cinematic, photorealistic, 4K. An emotional, black and white vintage photograph, natural light, documentary style, showing exhausted, waterlogged figures being pulled from the sea or clinging to minimal wreckage on a desolate coastline at early dawn. The scene conveys quiet despair and profound loss. Candid, high-detail, cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A high-detail, black and white vintage photograph, documentary style, of a heavily damaged Waco CG-4A glider, its wings mangled and tail sections broken, half embedded in a dense, 5-foot-high hedgerow and a muddy Normandy field. The scene captures the brutality of a hard landing. Natural light, somber atmosphere, cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A wide, black and white vintage photograph, documentary style, of a Normandy field littered with multiple severely damaged Waco CG-4A gliders, some piled awkwardly, others sitting forlornly with mangled wings. Open doors hint at the departure of occupants, under a somber, overcast sky, emphasizing widespread destruction. Candid, high-detail, cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A poignant, black and white vintage photograph, candid, high-detail, focusing on the haunted, distant gaze of an elderly veteran glider pilot. His face is etched with experience, perhaps holding a faded letter or journal, conveying the lasting psychological scars of war in a somber, introspective portrait under natural light. Cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A high-detail, black and white vintage photograph, documentary style, depicting a chaotic aerial view with multiple Waco CG-4A gliders in broad, descending circles over a landscape studded with tall, upright tree trunks, Ramos asparagus. Dust clouds obscure parts of the view, symbolizing confusion and danger during Operation Dragoon. Cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A candid black and white vintage photograph, natural light, showing young glider infantrymen, their faces apprehensive, receiving hurried, last-minute instructions from a seasoned pilot in a dimly lit, austere hangar. A Waco CG-4A glider looms in the background, emphasizing the immense risks and minimal preparation. High detail, somber atmosphere, cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A dramatic, black and white vintage photograph, high detail, documentary style, captured from inside a Waco CG-4A glider cockpit. The view through the windshield shows distant explosions and streaks of light, flak, while flak jackets are visibly lining the cockpit floor near the pilot's gripping hands, conveying intense danger during market garden. Cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A desolate, black and white vintage photograph, documentary style, of a heavily damaged Waco CG-4A glider, sitting abandoned and forlorn in a vast, war-torn Dutch field under a somber, gray sky. The image symbolizes the failure of Operation Market Garden and the isolation of its aftermath. Natural light, high detail, cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A powerful, black and white vintage photograph, high detail, documentary style, of a Waco CG-4A glider landed in a snow-covered, frozen landscape during the Battle of the Bulge. Heavily dressed soldiers unload medical supplies and provisions, conveying the harsh winter conditions and the urgency of a rescue mission. Natural light, somber atmosphere, cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A stark, black and white vintage photograph, high detail, documentary style, of a Waco CG-4A glider, severely damaged and nose down in deep snow, surrounded by a swirling haze of dark smoke, symbolic of black flak. The scene emphasizes intense danger and high casualties during a deadly day. Natural light, somber atmosphere, cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A high detail, black and white vintage photograph, documentary style, showing a Waco CG-4A glider, seen from slightly above, descending through thick chemical smoke that obscures the ground over a European landscape during Operation Varsity. The scene conveys flying blind and disorientation. Natural light, somber atmosphere, cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A chaotic black and white vintage photograph, high detail, documentary style, captured from a ground-level perspective. A damaged Waco CG-4A glider is partially hidden by debris, with faint red tracer lines crisscrossing the night sky in the background, abstractly hinting at an intense ground firefight, Battle of Burp Gun Corner. Somber atmosphere, cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A poignant, black and white vintage photograph, documentary style, split into two frames. One side shows a weathered, fabric-covered Waco CG-4A glider, the other side a sleek, modern space shuttle on a landing strip. This juxtaposition symbolizes the glider's forgotten legacy and technological evolution. High detail, natural light, cinematic, photorealistic 4K. A candid black and white vintage photograph, high detail, documentary style, showing a group of elderly glider pilot veterans, their faces showing wisdom and shared experience, gathered around a table with cups of coffee. One veteran gestures animatedly as if recounting a long-held story, reflecting camaraderie and belated sharing under natural light. Somber atmosphere, cinematic, photorealistic 4K.